Today we're looking at some of the strongest contraptions in the Ork army, the fearsome and deadly Mek Gunz. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy focused 40k channel, where we're all about getting the most out of our miniatures on the tabletop. We're back for another Ork Codex unit review here, and we're looking at the Mek Gunz, which in recent times have become some of the strongest weapons in the entire Ork arsenal. In the video we'll take a look at their datasheet, any obvious buffs and synergies in game, and how I would use them to maximal effectiveness on the tabletop. Sadly, in terms of real world money, these Mek Gunz are some of the most expensive things that Games Workshop sell. They have the unfortunate property of costing £30 in the UK and more elsewhere in the world, in combination with it being perfectly possible and downright strong to spam 18 of the things, and they are a fairly bad example of having to pay a lot of money if you want to access strong rules. Though in reality, just anecdotally, a lot of the people who I've met who are running lots of these things tend to use things like recasters. I'm not necessarily condoning that, but I can see why I wouldn't want to pay £540 for less than a third of my Ork army, to be honest. I've been going a bit more of the conversion route myself. One of the advantages with Mek Gunz is that they are very much just scraps cobbled together, and I've personally just been building up a small battery of these made out of plastic art and using Gretchen from the Grot's box. All that aside, in the background, Mek Gunz are typically large semi-static artillery pieces towed into battle by hapless Gretchen, who are then sent to man the guns as the boys charge forwards into the glorious combat. As we all know, Ork mechs never make two things the same, and their powerful artillery pieces might blast any sort of lethal projectiles at the foe, whether that's the straight energy blasts of the custom mega cannon, the crushing lifter-dropper technology of the Smasha gun, the enormous magnetic power of the Traktor Kannon, or the random force field bursts of the crazy Bubblechukka. Almost all the creations are incredibly noisy, and Gretchen are often sent to man the guns as a punishment to keep rebellious Grots at bay. Should the miserable Grot manning the guns survive for long, he'll be almost completely deafened, having to resort to a rudimentary system of sign language, which is very limiting for the poor Grot, as there's only so many signs that he can carry around. So let's take a look at what these things can do when we come to an actual game. So this is the datasheet for Mek Gunz, coming from the ever-reliable Warhammer. Mek Gunz are a heavy support choice for Codex Orks, and you can have between 1 and 6 Mek Gunz each, and in their cheapest loadout with the Smasha gun, they'll cost you 33 points. When you put them down on the tabletop, you put all in the unit within 6 inches of another Mek gun, and from then on they're treated as individual units, so if you're deploying them like this, they're going to very much turn out to be multiple small units, which can have its advantages, but can be bad if you're playing some sort of kill point game. The Mek Gunz have an interesting base profile. They have a measly movement of 3 inches, so besides some limited redeployments, they're fairly static artillery pieces. Weapon skill 5+, ballistic skill 4+, strength 2 for the Gretchen crew, toughness 5, 6 wounds, 6 attacks, leadership 4, and a 5+ save. So a very interesting and unusual profile indeed. Having 6 attacks at weapon skill 5 does mean that they might actually punch a few light infantry to death if they are tagged in close combat and get lucky. 6 wounds at toughness 5 is really quite a decent buy-in, and particularly so at 33 points for the Smasha guns. At around 6 points to wound, not very much is going to be very efficient at firing at them. You really want multi-damage for the amount of wounds that they have, but then you're sort of wasting the high strength and AP of anti-tank weapons, as you'll pretty much go straight through the flimsy toughness and armor save. Mek Gunz are legitimately some of the toughest things in the Ork Codex, point for point. Before we look at the actual profile of their guns, let's just take a look at their other special rules. They have Daka Daka Daka, which will give them the usual extra shots. We've already talked about their Mek Gunz rule, which is how they deploy, but interestingly enough they also have the Grot crew special rule. Basically, with a lot of other similar big gun type units, they typically have separate profiles for the crew and separate profile for the guns, but these are all represented on the single one model. Their Grot crew rule means that the Gretchen and the big gun are treated as one model for all rules purposes. So that means if you're within 1 inches of the enemy in combat with the Grot crew, then you're in combat with the gun. But it does specify that in terms of range and line of sight, all attacks from the Mek gun must be measured from the Mek gun and not the crew. This means that really having the crew around is a bit of a disadvantage rather than an advantage, both because they increase the footprint of the gun and mean that they're a little bit harder to deploy closer together, but also because you can potentially target the gun if you can see the crew, but you can't necessarily target whatever can see the crew without moving the gun. I've occasionally seen people using the Mek Gunz without the crew. In theory you really should be using the crew as well in a competitive setting. I totally understand the reasoning if you are running a lot of these things. You could be having up to an extra 108 Gretchen models on the board, which is going to take a lot of time to deploy, and they're sort of functionally useless in game. So I do get why people might be tempted to not bother with them, as it is a lot of extra model deployment and movement for no real purpose. Also bear in mind that as the guns are Gretchen, they won't be getting a clan trait, so you can't use something like Death Skulls on these guys, which would be absolutely insanely powerful. The best you can get is the Grot mobs, which we'll talk about in a second. So let's talk about the actual profiles of the guns then. First up we have the Bubblechukka, which is 45 points per gun. Now this is the most insanely random weapon that you could possibly shoot, and every single time that you fire the damn thing, it not only has heavy D6 shots, but it also has strength D6, so 1 to 6 basically, an AP of minus D6, so anywhere between -1 and -6, and also does damage D6 on top of that. If you do roll well for it, then it could be absolutely murderous, but you basically have 2 chances of making it near useless. Say if you roll a 1 or 2 for the number of shots, or 1 or 2 for the strength, it's really not going to be doing a fat lot that turn. For once I'm not even going to try and work out the maths of this thing, it's just so swingy that it has the chance of rolling really high, theoretically doing up to 36 damage in one turn if you roll everything perfectly. But so much of the time it's going to do absolutely nothing. It is a very orky weapon in that regard at least. It is likely to have a quite low strength, but very high AP and damage on average, meaning that it'll be usually quite good at chewing through things like elite infantry. Things like centurions might fear this thing quite a lot, and a battery of them could certainly be good for chipping a bit of damage off vehicles. Overall, the general consensus seems to be that they're just not quite as strong as some of the other options, so let's get on to those now. Next we have the custom Mega Cannon, which will cost you 60 points including the gun. This one's a flat, uncomplicated anti-tank cannon, 36 inches, D6 shots at strength 8, AP -3 and damage D6. It has the standard custom Mega Special rule, where if you have unmodified hit rolls of 1, then the bearer suffers 1 mortal wound after all of this weapon's attacks have been resolved. Now point for point, this one really is very killy. Each single gun will average you 4 damage against standard toughness 7 vehicles, and seeing as you could absolutely spam these if you wanted to, say if you took 10 of them for 600 points, in theory you could be killing something like 3 to 4 Predator tanks a turn in a single volley of Mech gun annihilation. I think their main issue compared with some of the others is that because they cost so much more, they're relatively more fragile point for point. Say for example, if you do invest the points in Smasher guns, you'll be getting nearly double the amount of wounds of Mech gun on the table for fairly similar firepower. Talking of the infamous Smasher guns, these are the ones that tend to get spammed at tournaments at the moment, just because they're ludicrously cheap and incredibly good point for point. Smasher guns cost you 33 points, they're 48-inch range, heavy D3 weapons, with AP -4 and damage D6. They have an interesting wounding roll, which means that basically you roll 2d6, and if it's greater than or equal to the target's toughness, then the attack successfully wounds. This means that these things are exceptionally good at wounding things that are toughness 6 or lower, and are pretty much designed to deal with multi-wound heavy infantry, things like Space Marine Centurions with high saves. Against toughness 7 vehicles, they'll wound about 58% of the time, which drops pretty heftily if you're targeting toughness 8 to only wounding 42% of the time. Whether or not that all-important roll of a 7 is a success is really quite a big break. Overall, this maths out that they'll be slightly better than the custom Mega Cannon against toughness 7 targets, and also have the additional damage of 48-inch range and less random swinginess from D3 as opposed to D6. Against toughness 8, they are slightly less efficient than the custom Mega Cannon, particularly if the target has an invul save like an Imperial Knight, but in all honesty it doesn't really matter because their durability is just so much better than the custom Mega Cannons, as they're only just over half the point per gun. For every 100 points in Smasher guns you put on the table, you'll be having a whopping 18 wounds of Mech gun that the enemy has to chew through, whereas for every 100 points of custom Mega Cannon, you'll only be putting down 10 wounds of Mech gun. So basically the Smasher guns have similar if not better damage output in most targets, while also being ludicrously more durable. It makes them all round the most competitive choice for Mech guns in my opinion. Finally, we have one slightly interesting choice in the Traktor Kannon. This one's a 45 point per gun model with a 48-inch range, is just heavy 1, strength 8, AP -2 and D6 damage. Now the Traktor Kannon, being its massive magnet array where it's supposed to grab flyers and crunch them into the ground, is unsurprisingly very good at dealing with flyers or anything with -1 to hit modifiers. That one shot automatically hits at 48-inch range. If the target is an enemy vehicle unit that can fly, then you roll 2d6 and pick the highest for the damage roll. Furthermore, if you are destroying a vehicle that has the fly keyword when you're shooting at it with this, it automatically crashes and burns or explodes, showering everyone around it with mortal wounds. You don't have to roll the dice. Now these are generally some excellent anti-flyer rules, and it's particularly nice to ignore -1 to hit modifiers, as they're particularly effective against an Ork army, being at ballistic skill 4 and 5. There are a few better hard counters to Eldar flyers than a whole battery of Traktor guns, and you could certainly surprise people with other different stacking modifiers, such as a Chaos player trying to stack loads of -1s to hit on a Lord Discordant or something. Unfortunately, despite auto-hitting, Compared with the other options, they are just a bit weaker if you aren't firing at their specific targets. Despite auto-hitting and also being more expensive, they actually do less damage per model than a standard Smasher gun aiming at a toughness 7 vehicle. Even if they're aiming at a toughness 6 -1 to hit flyer, they're still less points efficient than the Smasher gun against this target, even with their damage boost. They only actually become better than the Smasher guns if you're aiming at flyers that have -2 to hit or better. And while those are an important and scary threat to be able to deal with, I just don't really think they justify hamstringing yourself by having lower damage output and lower survivability against the rest of the field. So overall, in terms of gun balance, not the most balanced in the world. Smasher guns are just pretty much the best, though it doesn't necessarily mean that the other options are bad, just that they're not quite as good against all comers as the Smasher. So in terms of buffs and synergies that we can put on these units, they are obviously a little bit limited being Gretchen units, which means they can't get that clan culture, though they are a somewhat interesting choice in a freebooters type army list, as while they can't gain benefit from the clan culture themselves, they can trigger the competitive streak special rule, which means that nearby freebooter units in the shooting phase will get +1 to hit if the Mek Gunz destroy a unit. Hopefully your big battery of Mek Gunz might be able to take out an enemy unit in the shooting phase, and then allow say a nearby unit of looters to hit on force for the rest of the turn. Really though, the culture that the Mek Gunz really want to be is one of those new specialist mobs from Saga of the Beast. The Grot mobs detachment actually gives them a benefit. It gives them a 6+ invul save, which is actually going to be really relevant when you're only saving on a 5 anyway, and it allows them to reroll hit rolls of 1, both in the shooting and in the fight phase. Now Smasher guns were already taken in droves in competitive Ork lists. This just gives them 2 flat buffs to make them even stronger, and if I were wanting to spam these a bit, I'd most certainly want to take them in their own unique detachment dedicated to them. It's not to say that they're not strong in other Ork detachments as well, they certainly are, but it does mean that if you're taking enough of them, then forking out for their own detachment, maybe led by a weird boy, could well be worth it. Just out of interest, if you did take the full 18 Smasher gun list, took them with the Grot mobs detachment and took aim at some tanks, they do on average 50 wounds to standard toughness 7 vehicles, presuming they don't have an invul save at all, or 36 wounds on average to toughness 8 vehicles such as Lehman Russ tanks. That's all for a fairly measly investment of just under 600 points for the full squadron. Orks genuinely have some of the best anti-tank firepower in the entire game of 40k. In terms of character support for them, in general they tend to be quite independent and not have a ton of synergy with other units, but you could potentially use something like a custom force field mech to give them a 5+ invul save, which will certainly make them that bit more annoying to remove. A mech could also help pile on a few extra wounds on Mek Gunz to help keep them patched up, though this does have kind of limited value just because of how cheap those wounds were to begin with. In terms of stratagems, they are Gretchen units, so you can't use any on them, unless otherwise specifically stated. They can't use Grot shields, so in terms of buffing their damage output, all I'd really typically do was reroll maybe a damage result of 1 if you're feeling generous. You could potentially reroll one of the characteristics in terms of the number of shots or the strength on a Bubblechukka or a custom mega cannon, but in general terms I wouldn't think that would be something I'd do every single turn, particularly with all of the good stratagems in the Ork army. The Mek Gunz can be an interesting target for the loot it stratagem though, as they are technically vehicles, and they're destroyed quite easily, so you could set one up right next to a mob that you wanted to have a better armor save, and then improve that armor save with a command point when the enemy takes the bait and destroys the Mek Gun. So how would I run Mek Gunz in game then? In general they will win pretty much any straight shooting fight versus enemy armor, so the challenge is to get them into that straight shooting fight and keep them there for most of the game. With Smasher guns and Traktor Cannons, even though they have 48-inch range, I'd still be quite tempted to deploy them fairly aggressively in the deployment zone. Not necessarily right on the line, maybe behind some boys and Gretchen and stuff, but not necessarily right at the back, because if the opponent outranges them, or at least the targets that you most want to shoot are just beyond 48-inch range, then you're not going to be able to get there anytime soon with only 3-inch movement. In general, you want to maximise the sheer amount of line of sight that you can get with these. Deploying them up on hills is a great idea, though unfortunately as vehicles you can't set them up in the top floors of ruins. That's not allowed as per the core rules, so make sure your opponent isn't doing that if they are using Mek Gunz. If you can get any custom force field saves going, then that's perfectly reasonable, but in general I'd be wanting to prioritise that sort of power. For other more fragile Ork units in the list, the Mek Gunz will basically take a fair bit of chewing through with firepower, no matter what is firing at them. Custom force fields are most important if you don't already have the Grot mobs battalion, as at least that will give you a small invul save, if not a 5+ one. Provided you're in range, then it's basically just a game of point and delete at the enemy tanks and vehicles that you most want to destroy. Though as we said, they're also very efficient at taking out heavy infantry, particularly multi-wheeled ones such as Centurions. Mek Gunz and particularly Smasher guns can be a bit of a pain to roll out, and in theory they should be done one by one, but occasionally, if your opponent permits it, you can group rolls when they're all shooting at something that's obviously not going to die to any given Smasher gun, such as an Imperial Knight on full health for example. You can fast roll Smasher guns a little bit. Basically what I've seen people do is take all the hits and then to simulate the 2d6 beating toughness rule that they have, roll all of those dice once, then use all of those as the first dice out of the 2d6. If you're firing at a toughness 8 target, you could then just throw away all the ones, as you know they're never going to be successful even if the second dice is a 6. Then roll the second dice, roll the 2s together, and if any of them get 6s on a toughness 8 vehicle then they've wounded. Then roll all the 3s where you need a 5+, and so on. Obviously you can only do that if you're not at risk of your target immediately dying from the first gun or two, or all the rest will be wasted. And if you are using them, then seek your opponent's permission first. In general, most will generally be happy to, as it does save time, and watching someone roll a whole ton of Smasher guns in a row can be quite boring if they're not doing it efficiently. There are likely to be times when you're out of decent targets, and if you're moving then you may as well strongly consider advancing, as you could be hurtling around anywhere like 8 or 9 inches if you roll well for their advance roll. Later in the game, when the firepower is a bit less important, there can be reasonable units for spamming onto objectives, or even potentially charging and tying up the enemy units, as they are big meaty models and they might take a couple of combat phases to chew through for enemy troops. Finally, I just thought I'd share this Ork Mek Gunz spam list to showcase what people tend to do at the most competitive level. I won't go necessarily through the entire list, but it's basically 18 Smasher guns in a Grot mobs detachment with 2 Weird Boys and 3 units of Gretchen, as the Weird Boys can still use their psychic powers to jump and buff up the other units. It doesn't matter that they're technically part of the Grot mobs detachment. To cover them, we've got a ton of other Gretchen, which can all help screen out for the Mek Gunz, and then 3 huge units of boys to help deal with infantry and provide a massive countercharge threat, and also a bike war boss with to kill a claw to encourage your enemy not to be going and charging your big gun line. Finally, there's a few Death Skulls big mechs with shock attack guns who can add to the sheer weight of high AP firepower and also potentially fix up any mech guns that are nearby them. I think this list would have the potential to ruin the day of quite a lot of army lists, particularly ones that are heavy on vehicles. So overall, Mek Gunz are an incredibly strong Ork unit. I've certainly been enjoying using my ones in games, even though I'm not spamming them to this extent. I honestly wouldn't be too surprised if they FAQ the Smasher gun to be up a few more points, or change it in the next chapter approved, as it is just blatantly undercosted at the moment. Although if they do change that, it might mean that we see some of the other guns start to shine through again. Thanks very much for listening to an Auspex Tactics video. Feel free to subscribe if you'd like to see more Orks Tactics videos. We'll have plenty more coming over the month. And if you'd like to support the channel at all, I'd just like to mention my Element Games affiliate link down in the description below. That one works in the UK, and there's an Amazon one for people in the USA or Canada. Basically, if you were thinking about buying in some models sometime in the near future, and you were thinking about ordering them in, then consider clicking on one of those links before buying something, as a little bit of money goes to support Auspex Tactics without costing you any more at all. The Element Games one does give a slight discount on Warhammer products, usually between 10 or 20%, and they're pretty reasonable suppliers, so I can always recommend. Naturally, Amazon is Amazon, and that one in the US and Canada works for any other purchases, not just model stuff. So if you would like to help keep these videos coming, those can potentially be a way to support the channel on purchases you were thinking about making anyway. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.